the Dogra legacy. I always say Dogra is a born soldier, and if he joins army, he is a soldier twice. Looking back, when I see my own life, I can see only military. I was born in a family of soldiers or cavaliers. My grandfather was a cavalier, soldier in a Chirana regiment of the J&K State Forces, the Horse Cavalry. He had left service early to take care of the lands, etc., in the village. Then his eldest son joined again cavalry, bodyguard cavalry. And little later, his youngest brother, my uncle, also joined the bodyguard cavalry. Only my father joined civil service, judiciary. So I was brought up with the horses right from the birth. We were known as Tabela Wale because we had the horse stables, many horses. And I learned riding from the day one. In fact, in very young age, I could manage a horse, probably at the age of 6, 7, 8, alone going to the lands from my village Suchani on the now Pakistan border, collecting all my land produce and bringing alone back home. A routine. All my younger brothers did the same. So the horse, cavalry, and the military legacy, military atmosphere was in the family. Whether you call the military discipline, even military language, when in anger speak in Urdu, etc. And then the atmosphere in the village. Maximum employees in the government services were in the army. And when I joined the school, Raya, about 3 kilometers, A little later, my father decided to put me in another school in Ismailpur, about 6 kilometers, because there we had a very good teacher, Mela Ram, from my village. So my father wanted me to study there under him. So I used to go alone 6 to 7 kilometers every day, and again the friends were from the soldiers' families. For example, one very dear friend, Singh, was the descendant of General Singh and General Singh, his younger brother. General Singh of Chitral fame. It's another story. He was a living legend, and legend even today, whose bars are sung in the villages. He had died, and also his younger brother, General Bijay Singh, both had served in Gilgit, Chitral, and Skardu. In fact, Bijaypur is named after General Bijay Singh, younger brother of Bhai Singh. Bhai Singh had died in Chitral. That is another household story. But suffice to say that in the house of Major Govind Singh, the village of General Bhai Singh, General Bijay Singh, where General Bhai Singh's wife was alive, and whenever I visited that house, we had to go and touch her feet, which she would not allow, as she was a very pious lady with always a devotion, and not would think that if you touched her feet, probably you would bring something which is not right or not touchable. I've seen her. So that house itself was a military house. Again, both the brothers joined army. One went to 8 J&K Rifles, and the other went to Dogra Regiment, then became NCC officer, major, retired, still living, my age, 94 plus. He is again encyclopedia of military ethos of the Dogras, military stories. And that is what the Dogra military ethos is, or the Dogra legacy of the Kandi villages of Shivaliks, where we produced soldiers of the J&K state, later on Dogra regiment, And all the Indian Army, almost everywhere, mostly the armored regiments, cavalry regiments, then the mechanized regiments, tank rasala, what we used to call, and then all other regiments, the Punjab regiment, earlier on Frontier Force regiment. So, Dogras in the armored forces was something like fish to water. And that is what creates legacy. This is how I was brought up. And then I joined the military school in Jammu, created by Maharaja Hari Singh in the name of Maharaja Pratap Singh. It was called Maharaja Pratap Singh Rajput Military School. Absolute on the pattern of these now Sainik schools, in uniform throughout the day. Total curriculum was starting with the physical training period, then parade in uniform, drill, whole day in uniform, just exactly what happens in the army. So it was a military and military alone from day one till I joined the service, and that too again in the army. And at that crucial time, probably something what happens in centuries, that happened in 47 when I joined army. And then look at it, what opportunities came. Joined just before independence, or about the time of partition, and saw the partition and what we call the genocide. Then saw war closely. First day in the service was in war. In fact, the entire training took place in Srinagar, in Jammu, Udhampur Hills, Shivaliks. Again, war was on, and we were prepared, trained in a hurry, as we had lost 19 officers out of just less than 200. And we were, in fact, our training was also cut, as used to happen in emergencies throughout the world, and even in Indian Army. When 1971 war happened, or 65, the training was cut short and the officers were sent to the units to fight. Many of them fought and were martyred. So was the case with us. as I said, our training finished in July 48, and the first day of my service was against Pakistan, fighting in Fort Kamau in Uri sector, where exactly Brigadier Rajendra Singh had been martyred. And I served Fort Kamau, the famous battalion which produced General Thamaya, General Shri Nagesh, two chiefs of army staff later. And the unit was looking after Udi Bridge and the Udusa, the place where now the Setu, the bridge, the area where they cross over to Pakistan, that was in my control with the service of 1 month. So that is what the legacy, the military legacy is. And then see Brigadier Rajendra Singh coming from next village, Baguna, now Rajendrapura. My father and Brigadier Rajendra Singh were class fellows for 5 years in the primary school in Rajendrapura, in village Baguna, because my village had no school. In fact, my village had no school, no road, no dispensary, no post office. There was in fact nothing, not even enough water. The water dried up by end of May, and we had to shift to some other places, somewhere in the area of canals for a month or 2 months. Luckily, we had our land in the canal area where we shifted for 2 months till the rainy season and then came back after the rains when our ponds were full. There was no power, there was no well, there was no perennial water, it was only a pond. So brought up in that atmosphere, that background, and that hard life of the Kandi, the bone dry shivaliks. There was hardly much rain and no lands, and that's why perhaps most of us went to the army and proved very good soldiers, very tough soldiers. That is again part of the legacy of the Dogras. And I had met Brigadier Rajendra Singh before even joining the army, a few days before joining the army, at his Flagstaff House residence at Srinagar when he was the brigade commander, before he took over from General Scott, who, after having deployed the state forces along the border, perhaps in consultation with the Viceroy of India, Mountbatten, and the Field Marshal Auchinleck, the Supreme Commander, and Lord Ismay, who was Chief of Staff of Churchill. Although Churchill was not in power then, but Churchill never wanted to give independence to India. It was only Attlee, under the pressure of the Americans, who had seen the British colonial power ruling America, and Americans had to fight a war of independence against the Europeans, particularly the British. So they were very keen that all the colonies must be freed from the Europeans, particularly the British, who used to fleece the colonies, make them fight internecine wars, communal wars, divide and rule, and loot, take away everything, as Shashi Tharoor has now spelled out what the British did to India. And that's why India became poorer and poorer, poorer and poorer. By the time British left, there was nothing left in India. And it took a long time for recovery. And yet, India is now coming back to its own resilience, to its own latent strength, particularly under the present Prime Minister Modi, who is the truest Indian after a long time we have got, who can mold the country and its people to the real Indian who once had the country called the Golden Sparrow. This is my background as a soldier, and now my career in the army. For 10 years, from 1947 to 1957, when the J&K state forces were integrated with the Indian Army, taken over as a regiment, we passed through very, very trying time, many times humiliated, because from day one, from even before independence, but certainly from independence onward, Jammu Dogras, because of Maharaj Hari Singh, were denigrated by and almost hated by Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, who had raised some kind of anti-Dogra crusade in 1931. Of course, it was at the behest of the British. Why? Because Maharaja Hari Singh had propounded in the Round Table Conference in 1930-31 that he was for Indian independence. He was with Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru, and with Indians. He was the head of the princes, and he was made head of the princes with the view to hearing from him in the Round Table Conference that India was not ready yet and they would need another 50 years or so the British should continue. But he said exactly the opposite. And thereafter, the British were after his blood. And immediately after the Round Table Conference, they found Sheikh Abdullah ready to take up their cause of overthrowing Maharaja Hari Singh, and the British helped every way, creating internal communal rights, starting from Srinagar and spreading to even other parts of Jammu and Mirpur, Kotli, all those areas, and even to Jammu. Another reason behind all these disturbances in 1931 was, which even Sheikh could never comprehend, and that was because of the British deep strategy, what British called the game, strategic game, and they wanted to prepare for the third war, next war, which they thought would be against Russia, and by that time even China might be an ally of Russia. And as a part of great game, they wanted to take over Gilgit-Baltistan, which was the most strategic area, what we call the strategic heart of Asia. In fact, British were never happy to give the kind of suzerainty, a limited though, to the state, but it had been done by Maharaja Gulab Singh, who was very astute statesman, besides a great soldier. In fact, a unique personality, unique soldier statesman, unique Maharaja India produced in the 19th century, who has never been given his due because of the local rivalries, and particularly after Ranjit Singh, the attitude of the Sikhs and the Punjab towards the Dogras in general and the J&K state in particular, and of course the British, who were always the daggers drawn with the Dogras and the rulers of Jammu and Kashmir state, the Dogras, Gulab Singh, his descendants, Maharaja Hari Singh, J&K state forces never got their due from the British, and then the British infuriated, encouraged throughout the country the communal riots, agitations, and they did the same in J&K by encouraging Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah to fight against Maharaja Singh and against his forces and Dogras, and that is where our war started. That has been the cause of all troubles for J&K state. It was the Dogras had to fight on all fronts. In the 18th century, to carve out a Dogra state, or almost a Dogra empire, which survived all empires, that was Maharaja Gulab Singh with General Zorawar Singh, Mehta Basti Ram, General Khan. So all these Dogras from the plains of India who had never gone beyond the Himalayas, first time the Dogras created a strategic depth by conquering Ladakh, parts of Tibet, Gilgit, Baltistan. It is a unique history of the Dogras, which we were never allowed to read, to study, to do any research. Particularly, even after 1947, unfortunately, our University of Jammu and later Kashmir did nothing. Even after my retirement, when I requested the governor, General Krishna Rao, who had been chief of the army staff when I was a military secretary with the President of India, I had served with him even here when he was the corps commander, 16 Corps in Nagrota. I was the brigade commander in Jammu, officiating the GOC 26 division for a long time, and we had a very good relationship. So when I retired, he also became the governor of J&K, and I requested him to have a Department of Strategic Studies on the pattern of Maharashtra in Pune University. He said, what use? The Dogras don't read, don't study. Then I told him that precisely for this reason I want a Department of Strategic Studies, so that the Dogras read, understand, do research. What is Dogra? What is Dogriyat? What is Dogra military ethos? How the Dogras have been able to achieve what others have failed. No Indian empire survived the British Empire. It is the Dogra Empire which survived after the Sikh Empire was beaten by the British. And the Dogras Empire survived even the British Empire, which handed over the powers to India and Pakistan on 15th August. The Dogra Empire was still intact till the Pakistanis invaded on immediately, though after 15th August, But officially on 22nd October 47, what is now observed as a black day in India. That's all the part of history. But that is the Dogra's contribution, that in spite of all these problems, hurdles, difficulties created by the British from the top, Pakistan from the sides, and the Kashmiri Muslims under Sheikh Abdullah from all sides. And yet the Dogras saved the state, exceeded the state, handed over the state to India as a crown of India, and kept on suffering to the extent that while Ladakh, which was conquered and annexed by the Dogras to India and handed over to India in 47, has been given a status of the Union Territory. The Dogras of Jammu have been again clubbed with, in fact, under the Kashmiri Muslims, who have seen and ensured that Dogras keep on suffering. Somehow they feel that Dogras were cause of their suppression, which is not true though. And therefore they had started Quit Kashmir on the pattern of Quit India. Although Quit India was against the foreigners, whereas Quit Kashmir was against the Dogras, who were part of the state. This was the kind of atmosphere in which the Dogras have been sustaining, fighting, suffering, and yet holding on to their traditions and still contributing. Look at Rajendra Singh and his Dogras saved the state. And Siachen Bana Singh, a Dogra Sikh of Ranbir Singhpura, the first Parmavir Chakra of the state. Kargil War, 13 Jack rifles. Again, the battalion of the Maharaja Hari Singh and of General Zorawar Singh, Maharaja Gulab Singh's forces, which were raised by him in 1820, which completed 200 years last year. Magnificent 2 centuries, unparalleled. Not only creating the state, defending the state, helping the Sikhs in the battles of conquest of Afghanistan and the frontiers, protecting the frontiers with the Indian Army, fighting in World War I in support of the British, whatever it was, and sacrificing lives for the British in Burma, in Germany, France, and even in J&K operations. Out of 8,000, 2,000 were lost in operations, out of which 19 officers out of total 150 officers were killed. While in that period of 14 months, the Indian Army lost only 1,100 killed out of more than 1 lakh troops deployed. And the state forces, out of 6 to 8,000 infantry, 2,000 were gone. And the other 2,000 Muslims deserted, defected, killed their own Hindu, Sikh, Gurkha comrades and giant Pakistan, and created Azad Kashmir force. Total treachery. And even in spite of all this, the Dogras are holding on. That is the Dogra legacy. Though never so well recognized. But it is time now that the country, particularly during this Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, 75th year of independence, when India is remembering the freedom fighters one by one after the other, from one state to the other, but not yet the Dogras, because they had limited suzerainty and were not really under the British, so they did not contribute much, or they didn't have to fight much against the British. Therefore, we did not have many freedom fighters. But when the Indian freedom fighters were fighting against the British right from the early 19th century, Dogras were extending the frontiers of the country into Tibet, to China, Karakoram, and into those areas which gave us the strategic depth, particularly across the high Himalayas, where no one ever had gone from the plains of India. It was only the Dogras under General Zorawar Singh, later on General Baj Singh, Mehta Basti Ram, and so many general in Gilgit, Chitral, where we have sacrificed 5,000 with General Zorawar Singh alone perished in Tibet, later in Chishul. Another 10,000 we lost in the next 100 years in Gilgit-Baltistan area, apart from the contribution in World War I, World War II. Sacrifices. Dogras in one action in Baltistan, in the Bunji area, when Gilgit was attacked, to reinforce Gilgit, 5 Jammu and Kashmir infantry called Suraj Gorkha, while halting for the night at called Bhoop Singh Ki Padi, under Bhoop Singh, commanding the force of 1,200, were perished by deceit by the Chitralis and Dalil and all these states by an ambush. We lost 1,200, perhaps only a Gurkha woman jumped into the river and informed that the force had been totally annihilated by deceit, by ambush overnight, by throwing stones from the hills in the gorge and covering both ends with the river in front. So this is the price the Dogras have paid to create and hold the strategic depth, what we call the Western Tibet, Ladakh, Chashul, Gilgit, Baltistan, and ultimately Kashmir. Nobody talks about it. No credit to the Dogras about the sacrifices. And the British, for whom the state paid such heavy price, protected, created the empire, protected the empire, and yet the British ensured that the state was mutilated. They planned an attack well before 15th August, which was executed after 15th August. The orders were issued by the British Commander-in-Chief of the Pakistan Army, General Frank Messervy, signed by him, received by Major Unkar Singh Calcutta on behalf of his British Brigadier Moray in Banu Kohad Brigade, received on 20th August 47 to attack the state on 22nd October, 2 months and 2 days before the attack. That was the kind of planning the British had done against Jammu and Kashmir state and against India. Indians never knew about it, or if they knew about it, they did not bother about it, with the result that we are still at war. Even after 4 wars, we are still at war. We have not been able to settle and achieve what we would have. That is because there was some kind of animosity against the Dogras. And Dogras, having given their best quietly always and suffering, had 3 enemies. Pakistan in front, Kashmiri Muslims within, and the Indian leadership from above. The Dogras fought on 3 fronts, and all these 3 enemies did their best to denigrate the Maharaja, denigrate the state forces, denigrate Dogras, and nobody came to our rescue. And we are still suffering politically, militarily, socially, administratively, economically, every way. And now from the state we have come down to a union territory again, even after 74 years of suffering after the so-called independence. We are committed to suffer. Probably that is the fate of a Dogra, and that is the legacy of the Dogra, to continue fighting, continue serving, and continue suffering. That's what is happening.